people, and it seemed that was working for him, at least for a while, but then it turns out that the Philistines were going to war against the Israelites, so David was caught there. And last week we looked at the story of how God sort of got him out of that jam. Even though David didn't really deserve it, God graciously intervenes and arranges circumstances so that the Philistines decide they don't want anything to do with David, and they send David home, not yet to Israel, but to his camp that was still in Philistine territory. It was the camp called Ziklag. That was David's temporary home base. So the Philistines say, David, go back to Ziklag, and from there David was going to go back to Israel. So we pick up the action as David is headed back to his camp there in Ziklag. On page 467, we pick up the story. 1 Samuel chapter 30. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. David and the 600 men with him came to the Besor ravine, where some had stayed behind, for 200 men were too exhausted to cross the ravine. But David and 400 men continued the pursuit. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. David asked him, to whom do you belong and where do you come from? He said, I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites and the territory belonging to Judah and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag. David asked him, can you lead me down to this raiding party? He answered, swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them. He led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating and drinking and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds and all his men and drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, this is David's plunder. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind at the Besor ravine. They came out to meet David and the people with him. As David and his men approached, he greeted them. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. David replied, no, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and handed over to us the forces that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike. David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. When David arrived in Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, here is a present for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. He sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth, Ramoth Negev, and Jatir, to those in Ereror, Sifmoth, and Eshtoma, and to Rakal, to those in the towns of Jerahmeelites and the Kenites, to those in Hormah, Bor Ashan, Atach, and Hebron, and to those in all the other places where David and his men had roamed. This is the word of the Lord. Some of those names are kind of tricky to pronounce, aren't they? Our brothers and sisters in Jesus, I wonder if you've ever come to that point in life where you say to yourself, I don't think things could get any worse than they are. And then you say that, no sooner do the words leave your mouth and things go from bad to worse. I'm thinking maybe of a middle school student flunks a math test. Well, when you're in middle school, that's kind of devastating. Then you find out you've also been cut from the team, and things go from bad to worse. Or maybe some of you had the experience at work. And rumors of job cuts, layoffs, downsizing are swirling around the office. The business isn't doing very well. And your name is on the list of people that they might well have to let go. And as you start thinking to yourself, how am I going to take care of my family? How am I going to pay the bills? Who's going to hire me at this age? You get into a car accident and your car is totaled. And things go from bad to worse. Or maybe your marriage is on the rocks. You're fighting and quarreling all the time. You can't seem to get along. And just when things don't seem like they could get any worse, you find out that someone has stolen your identity, and now you have to try to cancel credit cards and find out who's taken it, and your whole life goes from bad to worse. Or maybe one more example. You go in for a surgery. It's supposed to be fairly routine, in and out in a day or two. And then you develop one complication and the next and the next. And things go from bad to worse. Some of you have lived that, actually. Some of you will recognize little snippets of these stories as part of your own story in life. And the question is, what do you do? What do you do when things go from bad to worse? Where do you turn? This is a story in front of us about things going from bad to worse. And there are at least three things, I think, in this story that show us where we can find strength when things go from bad to worse. Where to find strength? Well, the first thing, we find strength in God. Now, for David, things really do go from bad to worse. I kind of introduced the story already. David is off with the Philistines, and he wonders, how in the world am I going to get out of this? I have to go and fight my own people. And then God intervenes in these rather ordinary and yet still miraculous ways to deliver David, so that the Philistines say, we don't want this David around. We don't want to, he's just going to turn on us, so send him home. So David goes from this moment of fearing that he's going to have to fight his own people, and of course by that point he's already been on the run from Saul for about 13 years, and he's weary and he's worn out, and he gets out of this crisis and he gets to go home to Ziklag, his little temporary home base. And he and his 600 men that are with him, they maybe breathe a sigh of relief. They think, okay, now things are going to settle down. We've been through a lot. We're tired, we're worn out, but now life is going to settle right back down. And I don't know if this is exactly how it happened, but I imagine them, they're walking home, they're tired, worn out. They're taking their animals and they're, the soldiers with them, and they crest over a hill. And they know that just on the other side of that hill, they're going to see their tent camp, their little home base. But as they get closer, they see smoke rising up on the horizon. And as they come over the crest of that hill, they look down, and where there was supposed to be their little tent village, and where there was supposed to be the sounds of children playing, and where there was supposed to be their wives getting things ready for a happy reunion, they see nothing but rubble and smoke rising up from the ruins. And when they see this, the fear grips their heart, and they begin to run down to the camp to find out what has happened. And they see that their wives have been taken, their children have been taken, their animals have been taken, their wealth has been carried off. And in verse 4 we read that they wept until they had no strength left to weep. I don't know if you've ever been that heartbroken, where you cry until there are no tears left to cry. Now that tells us one thing right away. God's children are not immune from the pain and suffering of this world. David wasn't immune from it. We aren't immune from it. We'll all go through something. The story will be different, but we'll all be allowed to experience pain and suffering. Life will go from bad to worse for us. It'll happen to us. We'll come to that point where we cry till we have no tears left to cry. But then look what happens in verse 6. The crying, you can read it, the crying turns into anger. David is distressed because the men are talking about stoning them. They run out of tears of sadness and they start to talk to one another. We wouldn't be in this mess if it weren't for David. This was all David's idea. Go off and hide with the Philistines and go to war and leave our women and our wives and our children and our animals behind. This was David's idea. And the bitter anger begins to turn violent. Someone's got to pay. My wife is probably dead. David deserves to die too. So they talk about stoning David. And now things have gone from worse to even worse for David. Now, it'd be easy to jump in and try to defend David here. But we have to remember David bears a lot of blame, actually. Back a few chapters earlier, I think it's chapter 27, David was off raiding against the Amalekites. He was doing these little daytime skirmishes, going up, raiding, and actually killing a lot of the Amalekite people. He was kicking a hornet's nest. He was antagonizing them. We would look at this and we would say, David, you were asking for this. You're just getting your just desserts now. Probably how we look at this. And to an extent, we'd be right. David was deserving some of this. But look at what David does. Second part of verse 6. What does David do? David finds his strength in God. Here's what's so remarkable about that. God doesn't look down at us when we get into trouble and when things go from bad to worse. And God doesn't say, well, let me see now. Did you do anything to deserve this? You did. Well, then you'll have to deal with this yourself. No. David doesn't deserve God's comfort. He doesn't deserve God's strength. He doesn't deserve God's presence. And yet God graciously receives David and he gives him strength. What a God of grace. What mercy. What compassion that is. No matter how far we may have fallen, God will not forsake us. No matter how many mistakes we make, no matter how many times we repeat the same sin over and over and over again, no matter how many times we make our own bed, God does not say, well, now you have to sleep in it. You're on your own for this one. God strengthens David. You and I need a bedrock in times of trouble. When things go from bad to worse, we need to be able to go to God. And we can. We need to find our strength in God. Now, there are a lot of other places we might be inclined to look for strength and to be replenished. But I'll tell you, there's only one place that can ultimately strengthen us, and that's in the presence of God. And we do that in prayer. And not just the prayers of, Lord, I need this and this and this, but Lord, I want to be with you. Enjoying prayer as the presence of God, resting in the presence of God. Remembering in prayer who we are because of Jesus. Remembering in prayer that we belong to Him in life and in death. Remembering that in prayer that God claims us as His very own children. That's what it is to strengthen ourselves in God. And the other part of that, look at else what David does. In verses 7 and 8, David, it's kind of a strange part. We may not see exactly what's going on. David asks Abiathar the priest for the ephod. Well, the ephod was something that you wore. It was something that the priest wore. And it was really the tool of the trade for a priest. It was the priest's job to seek the presence of God on behalf of the people. And the ephod was sort of the symbolic tool, if you will, that let the priest do that. Essentially what David is doing is he's saying, Abiathar, I need to seek God's direction. I need wisdom and leading from God. And that's what David does. He asks, Lord, should I go after these people who have raided our camp? Right? David's seeking wisdom. He's seeking direction. The good news about this story for us, we don't need an ephod. We don't need an earthly priest. Think about this. You and I have direct access to the throne room of God. When things go from bad to worse, we can cry out to God and say, Lord, help. What should I do? Lead me, guide me, tell me what I need to do. Now, God doesn't answer in an audible voice. He doesn't, send us an email or anything like that, but He will lead us and guide us. We can respond and act in faith that God is directing our steps. So when things go from bad to worse, we can strengthen ourselves in God. But that's not all. We can also strengthen ourselves in the victory that God gives us. David asks, Lord, what should I do? And God says, if you go and chase the Amalekites, you will catch up to them, you will overcome them, you will defeat them, you will be victorious. And so what does David do? He rallies the troops, he gets the 600 men and says, God says we should go after them. So they do. Now, there's this little part in the story where they come across this Egyptian slave. Here's what's going on, and here's what's so remarkable about this. The Amalekites are on their way. They're fleeing. And one of the generals in the army, one of his soldiers or one of his aides becomes sick. And the general says, you're just going to slow us down. So stay here. Don't, he's leaving him to die in the wilderness, this Egyptian slave. Well, 3 days pass. This guy hasn't eaten anything. He's hungry. Somehow he's recovered from whatever illness he had that was slowing him down. And David and his army come across this man. And here's a slave who probably meant nothing to his master. He was probably seen as just a hindrance. A slave left in the wilderness, and God says, I'm going to use this as the way to bring victory to David. So David says to this man, hey, where do you come from and where are you going? And the story comes out, yeah, I'm part of the Amalekites and we burned this city to the ground. David says, can you take me to where your people are? Well, the Egyptian servant's no dummy. He says, I can, but you better not kill me for it. So David says, okay. So off they go. And you read in verses 17 through 19, David and his army of 600, they come across the Amalekite camp, and they are partying hard. They're reveling. Probably they're intoxicated, and so they weren't really in any condition to fight. They're celebrating, and we read in verse 19 that David goes down and fights from dusk until dawn. Different translations will say that just a little bit differently, but the point is still the same. David goes from dusk until the evening of the next day fighting these Amalekites. And he destroys them, all with the exception of 400 that managed to get away. Now here's what's remarkable about that. It's clear the scope of this victory is enormous. And even as big as this victory is, still 400 get away. Well, that gives you a sense of how big this Amalekite army really was. And here's David and 400 people. They leave behind 200 who were too weary to go on, so it's just 400 plus David. And they wipe out this Amalekite army. Now, isn't that something? David didn't deserve this victory. Actually, just the opposite. He kind of provoked the Amalekites. Right? We already said he's kind of getting what he deserves. So he doesn't deserve the victory. On his own, he doesn't have the strength to win that victory. He hasn't earned it, and yet God graciously gives this incredible victory. David routs the Amalekites. Now, as incredible as this is, it really paints just a picture of a greater victory, doesn't it? It gives us a glimpse of the victory that we win in Jesus. Now think of it this way. The Amalekites were a pretty formidable enemy for David, but the enemy that we face, sin, our past, all our failures, all of our sins and our shortcomings and our guilt, that hangs over us. The power of Satan to work in our hearts and minds, to twist around the truth of God's Word so that we begin to believe lies about ourselves, that's a powerful enemy. And if that's not enough, Paul reminds us that the greatest enemy is death. Sin, Satan, death. These enemies are far greater than any raiding party, than any battlefield enemy. And yet Paul writes in Colossians chapter 2, Ben read this morning and reminded us of the power of Colossians 3, but in Colossians 2 we read this marvelous passage where Paul says that Jesus has come into this world and he's nailed the charges that are against us. He's nailed those to the cross. And he makes a public spectacle of our enemy. He wins us the victory. A victory we haven't earned, a victory we don't deserve, a victory we don't have the strength for, is given to us in Jesus. That is the victory. That is the greatest victory that we have. And that victory gives us strength to face our momentary trials and suffering. When we rejoice in the victory that God has given us, it helps us face life when life goes from bad to worse. I'll give you an example. I'm a sports fan, but I'm sort of limited to hockey. That's my big sport. So I don't really watch a lot of basketball or football, but a couple weeks ago, NCAA March Madness. And a few of us got together. We watched it was Villanova against University of North Carolina. Now again, I don't pick brackets. I don't predict winners. I would do terrible at all that. But I know enough to know you had a really good game here. The lead went back and forth. Well, there was near the end of the game, Villanova was ahead by, 8 or 10. And then University of North Carolina just kind of chipped away at the lead. About 10 seconds left. Villanova's ahead by 3. University of North Carolina needs 3 to tie. 4.6 seconds left in the game. 3 points. Ties the game. And the crowd went wild. 4.6 seconds left. So Villanova inbounds the ball, brings it up the court. And as the buzzer sounds, another shot from the three-point line. The horn sounds, the clock is 0, and the ball drops through the net. And Villanova wins at the buzzer. And you know what? That whole stadium erupted into just cheers and confetti and streamers, and the players all pile on top of each other. Even if you don't get into basketball, that was pretty thrilling to watch. If basketball's not your thing, you've seen the same kind of thing with running, hockey, football, whatever. One thing I think you take away from that is when you see a victory like that and it sort of gives you the goosebumps, we are meant to rejoice. We are meant to celebrate victory. Now, sports is one thing. In the big scope of things, it's pretty small. But listen, we are meant to rejoice in the victory that Jesus has given us. We are meant to rejoice in that victory. And here's what else. When we are rejoicing in that victory, you know what that does to our what Peter calls our momentary trials and sufferings? It pales in comparison. I mean, can you imagine one of these players from Villanova that had just won the championship? They're dogpiling, and he starts to think, wait a minute, let's see, I got a math test tomorrow. I've got bills I've got to pay. No, of course not. Because in that moment, the joy of victory made everything else pale in comparison. No, listen. When life goes from bad to worse, it's not to deny the pain of what's happening. But it is to say, remember the victory. Remember the victory that we have won in Jesus. Sin no longer stands against us. Death itself cannot keep us. Satan's lies hold no power over us. That strengthens us in victory, doesn't it? That strengthens us when life goes from bad to worse. And then one final thing. We can strengthen ourselves in God, strengthen ourselves in the victory He gives, and finally strengthen ourselves in grace. Here's what happens. David wins this victory he didn't earn, victory he didn't deserve, victory not in his own strength. And they retake all the women and the children and the animals and the wealth and the fancy garments and the silver and the gold, whatever else was there, and they're bringing it back. Now keep in mind, 200 of David's men were too exhausted to go on. They had to leave them at this little ravine, and they have to recover their strength. So only 400 of David's men go to fight this battle. Now the 400 men who went into battle come back to the 200 who are too exhausted, and they say, hey, guess what? We're going to give you your wives back and your children back. But that's it. The rest of it is for us. All the wealth, all the silver, all the gold, all the animals, whatever else the plunder was, you don't deserve it. You see what they've done there? You see what these 400 men have done? No sooner have they won this supernatural victory, and they say the victory was earned and it wasn't given. We earned this victory. We earned it. They assumed that victory was earned and not given. Now, it's easy to point the finger, but you know what? That's our default mode, isn't it? That's for you and I. It's our default mode. It's earned. It's not given. It's why some of us have a really hard time putting up with those folks around us who are pretty immoral people. We'd look at them and we'd say, oh, look at all the choices they've made. Look at their life. It's a mess. And they've just done so many bad things. We've forgotten that victory is given and not earned. It's not just that we look into their lives and say, you know what, you're doing things that are harming you. No, we look down our noses at them and say, oh, look at you. That's why some of us have a really hard time forgiving other people. Because in our mind we're saying, I would never do something like that. See, we've forgotten that victory is given, it's not earned. It's why some of us look down at people who aren't as successful, who don't work as hard. And we say, oh, I'm just better than they are. It's because we've convinced ourselves that victory is earned and not given. Now, the writer of 1 Samuel, in verse 22, calls this group of 400 people, he says, they're evil men and troublemakers. Doesn't pull any punches there. This is a big deal. Look at how David responds in verse 23. He says, no, my brothers, with real compassion, real kindness. And then he goes on to remind them, he says, the victory that we've just won was a gift. God has given this to us. We didn't earn it. We didn't deserve it. God gave us the victory. And so we have to treat the spoils of war as it is. We have to treat that as a gift and not something we've earned. So we share it all equally. People who stayed back are the same as the people who fought because victory is given. It's not earned. You see, for us, that same principle, that victory is given and it's not earned, that has to guide our steps. It has to guide our lives. Israel, from that moment on, had to live by grace. You see, and one of the ways we can tell that the grace of God has penetrated our hearts is that we live as though victory is given and it's not earned. We don't look down our noses at people that have their lives in a mess, who make mistakes, who don't do the things that we think they ought to do. We don't look down on them. We realize that everything we are and everything that we have has been given to us. It's a gift. It's not something we've earned. Even in Colossians 2, the passage that I mentioned earlier, Paul says that Jesus shares the spoils of war with us. Everything that we have is a gift of God's grace. That helps us when life goes from bad to worse. We can look at our lives and say, well, I am what I am by grace. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. I am who I am what I am by grace. It's all grace. So what do you do when life goes from bad to worse? It will. It will. We're not immune from that. But we can strengthen ourselves in God. God doesn't turn us away. Even when our life is, the